You hear footsteps long before the door opens. Slow, deliberate, echoing down a corridor carved from cold imperial stone. For a moment, you wonder if this is the day the silence breaks. If maybe someone has finally come not to feed you, but to speak to you, to tell you a story, or simply to say your name. But when the door creaks open, there is no greeting. Only a bowl of porridge already losing its warmth to the draft. The woman sets it down without meeting your eyes. She leaves just as quietly, her footsteps fading into the endless hush of walls built for emperors, marble floors meant for silk and ceremony, not bare feet that have never danced. A breeze slips through the iron-barred window. Dawn washes the rooftops of Vienna, but this lonely tower chamber remains untouched by morning light. You do not know your age. You do not know the world beyond these stones. You only know the dust motes that spin in the air like secrets, and the feeling, somewhere deep, that you were meant to live a different life. But you were born royal, and you were born different, in a time when different was not allowed to exist in a palace. Your story is not written in marble plaques or royal archives. It survives instead in whispers, erased letters, sealed journals, and the briefest traces left in forgotten attics and monastery ledgers. This is not just a story about kings and crowns. It is a story about the children they hid, the children they could not allow the world to see, the ones history tried to erase, yet whose quiet existence still echoes, asking one question: who decides whose life is worthy of being seen? History likes to pretend it is made only of triumphs, marble statues, coronation paintings, burnished medals, royal proclamations admired across centuries. But the truth, the real truth, is that history is also built out of silence. It is mortared with the names that were never written, the voices that were never recorded, and the rooms no one was allowed to enter. This story belongs to those rooms. Before we step further into corridors of polished stone and velvet-lined cradle rooms, before we whisper through palace gardens where monarchy and myth braided into one seamless illusion, we must understand why we are here, why we dare to speak for those who never received the chance to speak for themselves. We are not here to sensationalize suffering, or to exploit forgotten lives as spectacle. We are here because to omit them again would be another kind of cruelty. We are here because history erased them once, and silence should not be allowed to perform the same violence twice. In centuries defined by crowns, bloodlines, and the godlike power of royal birth, perfection was currency. A child born to rule needed to be strong, clever, articulate, graceful, and, most importantly, visibly flawless. The world believed monarchs were chosen not merely by politics or birthright, but by heaven itself. Kings were God's reflection on earth. Queens embodied divine destiny. Princes and princesses were symbols, living proof that a dynasty deserved to exist. So what happened when a royal child did not fit that myth? What happened when a baby arrived with a face shaped by a genetic variation no one yet understood, a heart perhaps fragile, a mind that grew at a pace outside the court's rigid rhythms? What happened when a child smiled with unfiltered tenderness in a world obsessed with protocol, hierarchy, and performative strength? History's answer, whispered through private letters and shuttered nursery doors, was chilling in its simplicity. They disappeared, not always by death, though death often followed. More often by quietness, by separation, by erasure. A nurse would be assigned in secret. A room would be chosen away from visitors' eyes. A story would be crafted. The child died in infancy, or went away for treatment, or simply never existed at all. Portraits would not be commissioned. Birth records would be altered, sealed, or scratched out. Royal genealogies would skip them neatly, like a thread snipped from a tapestry before anyone noticed. This wasn't done because these children were unloved as individuals. In private moments, there were tears, poems, whispered prayers, small keepsakes tucked in drawers. In some rare homes, there were even lullabies, little hands held tightly, and attempts at tenderness behind locked doors. But the system, the ancient machinery of monarchy, did not allow space for imperfection. These children threatened the illusion. And illusions are what kingdoms live on. If a royal child could be born different, people might begin to ask dangerous questions. Was the blood truly sacred? Was divine right truly ordained? Was monarchy truly superior to ordinary life? And so, to preserve power, families sacrificed truth. They traded innocence for image. They built marble monuments above ground and buried human stories beneath it. That is why this documentary does not simply recount events. It restores presence. It returns humanity to the shadows of palaces and the corners of archives. To tell this story responsibly, we do not name where names have been erased in dignity. We do not invent tears or tragedies where evidence is thin. Instead, we walk through the historical record carefully, respectfully, leaning only on letters, journals, payroll ledgers, nanny diaries, physician notes, and the faint trace lines left by people whom history tried to make invisible. We do not show faces that never consented to be seen. We do not dramatize pain. We do not pretend to speak the internal thoughts of those children, because their inner worlds were theirs, sacred and unknowable. Instead, we ask the question history refused to ask. What does humanity owe to its most vulnerable? As we go forward, you will see light falling through barred windows. You will see small rooms in grand palaces, toys left untouched, folded linens in forgotten nurseries. Not symbols of tragedy, but symbols of something else, something quiet, resilient, impossibly tender. Because despite erasure, these children existed. They played. They wondered. They found moments of delight in gardens, in music, in colors, in birds, in snow. Their humanity was never the weakness. The weakness belonged to the world that feared them. Today, we understand Down syndrome as a chromosomal difference, trisomy 21, a genetic variation found in about 1 in every 700 births, across every continent, language, race, and social class. Science does not rank worth. Biology does not grant royalty. The chromosome does not ask for permission to exist. But centuries ago, the world did not have this understanding. It only had superstition, pride, and fear. And when power fears innocence, history hardens. That is why we remember, not to condemn, but to learn. Because the lesson here reaches beyond palaces, beyond crowns, beyond gilded cradles. It touches every society, every era, every family that has ever faced the question, do we value people for what they represent, or for who they are? In telling this story, we open a window where once there was a door closed and bolted. We do not force light in. We simply let it fall gently, the way morning sunlight falls through the dust in a forgotten room. For those who never stood on palace balconies, who never had their portraits painted, who never walked in coronation processions, this is not pity. This is acknowledgement. It is remembrance. It is restoration. It is a whisper to the forgotten. You were here. And now we begin. To understand the fate of the forgotten royal children, we must first step back, not into the quiet rooms where they were hidden, but into the grand halls where power displayed itself with confidence and certainty. Before we can see the shadows, we must look directly at the light that cast them. Europe between the 1600s and early 1900s was a continent obsessed with inheritance, legacy, and divine legitimacy. Thrones did not simply rest on military force or diplomacy. They rested on a myth. The myth of perfection, of chosen blood, of a family touched by God, above ordinary humanity. From Versailles to Vienna, from St. Petersburg to Madrid, royal portraits told the same story. Flawless children in silks and lace. Miniature adults posed beside gleaming globes and velvet-draped thrones, tiny hands resting on gilded scepters. These images were not just art. They were propaganda. They were promises to the world that order, hierarchy, and divine right remained intact. But beneath that grandeur lay fear. Fear that if the illusion cracked, everything would crumble. Court physicians whispered behind closed doors. Ministers drafted contingency plans for scandal. Midwives prayed quietly before royal births, knowing that what they saw first could determine a child's fate. A single physical deviation, a facial difference, slower development, an irregular heartbeat, could be interpreted not as nature's variation, but as cosmic indictment. In a palace, a newborn was not simply a child. A royal birth was a political event, and a royal child was a national asset or a liability. Scientific knowledge of genetics did not yet exist. Chromosomes were unseen mysteries. Medicine lived in a twilight world between observation and superstition. A child born with features we now recognize as Down syndrome was not understood biologically. They were interpreted symbolically. A sign, a warning, a punishment for hidden sin. a flaw in a bloodline that claimed divine favor. To modernize, this logic feels almost impossible. But power creates its own logic, one that bends morality to self-preservation. In eras when monarchs feared rebellion, religious scrutiny, foreign rivals, and internal noble factions, vulnerability, even in a child, became dangerous. And so, a system emerged. A system of controlled visibility and silent removal. A system that measured worth by ability to fulfill dynastic purpose. A system where love and loyalty were real, but powerless against political necessity. Nannies and attendants were chosen not for tenderness, but for silence. Rooms were selected for distance from court life. Official announcements came swiftly, often within hours, declaring a child lost to illness. Sometimes a priest was summoned not to bless a life, but to sanctify a secret. There were moments of compassion, yes. There were mothers who wept at night, fathers who paced sleeplessly, siblings who asked questions and were shushed with urgency. Some families arranged private care in convents or country estates, trying to preserve dignity in the only way they imagined possible, through concealment rather than cruelty. They convinced themselves they were protecting the child from pressure, ridicule, or exploitation. And in some cases, they were. But intentions do not erase reality. A locked room is still a locked room, even if furnished softly. A child hidden for their own good is still hidden. The palaces of Europe were theaters. Everything was performance, ceremonies, diplomacy, marriage alliances, carefully orchestrated public appearances. Royal children were trained from infancy to wave, to bow, to memorize languages, to play instruments, to move through glittering salons with composure far beyond their years. They were symbols before they were people. A child who could not be molded into that role was not simply different, they were unstageable. And a star who cannot take the stage in a system built on spectacle is not allowed to exist in the script. And so they became ghosts. Ghosts who breathed. Ghosts who laughed. Ghosts who looked out of narrow windows and wondered at the world they were told was not theirs to enter. Yet outside palace walls, the world did not operate by such cruel rules. In villages, children with Down syndrome lived among family, contributed to daily life, found roles suited to their pace and talents. Not always easily, not always without hardship, but openly. A farming family did not require a child to be a diplomat or to uphold national myth. They required affection, effort, and presence. They understood value differently. But royalty measured value in lineage, in stability, in perfection projected onto international stages. The crown, as an institution, could not imagine a life that was meaningful without power. And so it struggled to imagine dignity without visibility or purpose without grandeur. This was not merely ignorance, it was ideology. And ideology, especially when welded to power, creates tragedy not from malice, but from fear. Fear of weakness, fear of shame, fear of losing control. If a crown was meant to reflect divine order, then any deviation, even in a child, threatened the entire structure. Better, they believed, to hide deviation than to confront the idea that royalty was not immune to the randomness of nature. And yet, in private letters and diaries, we find tenderness. A queen writing prayers for a child she could never publicly acknowledge. A nurse saving drawings in a box long after the child was gone. A monk recording an unnamed boy's laughter in the margins of a ledger. A gardener remembering the joy of a mysterious playmate who appeared only when the palace was quiet. These traces matter. They are proof that humanity survived in corners even when power denied it on stage. But they also remind us of the cost, of what happens when identity is seen as duty before it is seen as existence. The forgotten royal children were not failures of biology. They were casualties of myth. Myth gave crowns their weight. Myth made dynasties. And myth demanded sacrifices, not of enemies, but of innocence. As we move forward into the individual stories, the prince in the English countryside, the infant in the French court, the girl in the Russian nursery, the boy in the Ottoman cage, we must hold one truth firmly. These children did not fail their kingdoms. Their kingdoms failed them. History shines bright on marble statues and golden thrones. But real history, human history, lives also in the dust in quiet rooms, in unspoken lullabies, in the hands that never got to wave from balconies. Before we meet them, we pause here, in the space between myth and memory, between splendor and silence. Because understanding the world they were born into is not just context. It is confession, and acknowledgement is the first step toward remembrance. Now that we understand the world that demanded perfection, we turn to the children who quietly contradicted it. Their lives unfolded in the margins of empire, in quiet rooms where silk curtains and stone walls offered no comfort, only separation. Their names appear briefly in diaries, in payroll books, in unfinished portraits, in letters written with trembling hands, then vanish as if history itself looked away. We don't approach these lives as tragedies for entertainment. We approach them as truths that deserve breath again. Let us walk through palaces where echoes remain. England, the boy who loved the garden. On the grounds of Sandringham, where perfectly trimmed hedges once framed royal strolls, a small farmhouse still stands. It looks ordinary, almost modest. Yet for a few short years, it sheltered a boy born into extraordinary lineage. Prince John, youngest son of King George V. In the photographs from his early childhood, he stands in sailor suits, smiling like any child of privilege might. But as his seizures began and his development diverged, the palace's tone shifted. The cheerful public announcements faded. Appearances ceased. The official narrative changed from celebration to quiet removal. He spent his last years not in gilded nurseries, but under open skies, laughing at birds, fascinated by simple games, finding delight in a world that expected him to represent a kingdom rather than just be a child. When he passed away at 13, a royal letter described his death as a release. Yet his nurse kept his drawings. And drawings are never kept for secrets, only for someone loved. This is not a story of shame, but of a boy who found joy despite it. France, the infant history tried to forget. In the palace of Fontainebleau, corridors once filled with rustling gowns and murmured diplomacy, a child arrived in 1640 whose existence unsettled a dynasty. Born to Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, this infant did not conform to the ideal image of a future prince. Physicians quietly described features now associated with Down syndrome: soft facial contours, weak muscle tone, difficulty feeding. The official record said the child simply failed to thrive. Court whispers said something else. The queen wept in private chapels. Royal astrologers speculated on star alignments. Blame shifted like candlelight, never toward biology, always toward sin or fate. The baby lived 43 days. No scandal erupted, no monuments bear his mark. Yet in personal letters preserved in Vatican archives, a physician wrote one line: he was peaceful. He did not cry. A sentence like a prayer for a life barely allowed to begin. Russia, the girl in the quiet wing. In Tsarskoye Selo, where peacocks once wandered manicured grounds and chandeliers glowed like frozen sunlight, a grand duchess appears only as a shadow in history. Unnamed in official genealogies, but present in payroll ledgers and in the journals of ladies-in-waiting. She played with dolls into adolescence. She wandered if not carefully watched. She laughed easily, sometimes at nothing others could see. Her development did not mirror the rigid court lessons of posture, languages, etiquette. So the palace built a life of seclusion for her, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of what her presence might imply. Then came the revolution. In 1917, as carriages were abandoned, jewels sewn into hems, and desperate trains carried a dynasty into exile or death, her records abruptly cease. No grave is marked. No final entry explains. We do not know her fate. But we know this: someone once paid for her attendance for many years. Someone cared, quietly, out of sight. Even empires fall, but tenderness leaves footprints, faint but real. Spain echoes in a dynasty obsessed with purity. The Habsburgs of Spain guarded their bloodline with fierce pride, and through generations of intermarriage. With each generation, physicians noted more fragile births, though language was limited and often cruel. Where official portraits show perfect poise, medical notes reveal truth. Children born with differences, hidden, unnamed, recorded only as infantes who did not survive. One physician, later punished by the Inquisition, dared to write that perhaps these children were not curses, but variations of nature. He observed joy in one young girl's eyes when she heard music, gentle affection she showed to everyone she met. His recognition of humanity was radical, dangerous, even. He was silenced. His patient was erased. But his notes remained, tucked in a false book binding, discovered centuries later. Sometimes history defies forgetting, even when forgetting is ordered. Ottoman Empire, The Prince in the Cage. Topkapi Palace holds rooms once reserved for heirs too dangerous to kill outright, yet too threatening to be free. The Kafes, a gilded confinement, intended for political princes. But one story tells of a different prisoner, a child born not ambitious but different. For over 2 decades, food was delivered to a room records claimed belonged to no one. Guards reported laughter, songs repeated softly, colored glass arranged on the floor into patterns only he understood. When succession crisis forced every chamber open, witnesses described an adult with the wonder of a child, sitting amid a mosaic he spent years creating. No cruelty marked his conditions. Only solitude shaped his world. He lived, he created, he imagined, without audience, without recognition. When records stop, silence again becomes his home. But silence cannot erase beauty created in private. Bavaria, a quiet life with songbirds. At Nymphenburg Palace, elegance sits heavy in the air. Manicured French gardens, majestic fountains, murals of gods and heroes. Yet inside, one wing was known quietly among servants as the quiet chamber. There, a princess named Alexandra grew not into a court debutante, but into a gentle soul who adored canaries and learned little lessons slowly, lovingly. Her governess wrote of teaching her how to hold a spoon, how to trace letters, how to listen to music with hands pressed to her chest, as if feeling each note. When she died, she was buried without titles or procession. But the diary that described her still breathes life across time. We measure history by its noise, wars, coronations, revolutions. But here, meaning lies in stillness. A young woman listening to birds with complete joy. A life may be quiet and still be full. Not tragedy, witness. Across nations, across centuries, the pattern repeats. A royal birth. A quiet diagnosis long before science had language. A door that closed softly. A life lived in shadows, but lived nonetheless. Moments of laughter, of curiosity, of affection. These were not failed heirs. They were full human beings in a world unable to see them as such. When we examine their stories, we do not mourn only what they lacked: visibility, titles, public celebration. We honor what they had. Songs hummed, birds fed, snow touched, hands held in secret, joy found in simple things, pure and unpolitical. They lived as children do, unburdened by the weight adults placed upon them. And in recognizing that, we reclaim their dignity from the silence that once swallowed it whole. To understand why these children vanished into the quiet folds of royal history, we must abandon the myth of simple villains. The story is more complicated and, in many ways, more unsettling. They were not hidden because they were unloved. They were hidden because they were inconvenient to a world built on illusion. Monarchy did not operate like a family. It operated like a machine of legitimacy. And every machine has parts it cannot admit to breaking. Let us examine the 4 forces that shaped this silence. 1. The crown's fragile illusion. The first force is perhaps the most powerful: image. Kings and queens claimed authority not only through politics, but through symbolism. They were supposed to be chosen by God, blessed with superior lineage, born into a destiny beyond mortal reach. To question the perfection of a royal child was to question the perfection of the throne itself. If a royal infant appeared different, the palace feared the question the world might ask: if royal blood can falter, what else in this empire is flawed? In an age without genetics, faith and perception were law. The birth of a child with visible differences was not seen as nature's randomness. It was seen as divine commentary. Or worse, as political vulnerability. A hidden prince could topple faith, fracture alliances, invite ridicule, and hint at weakness in bloodlines meant to look eternal. So the royal illusion demanded silence. The crown had to shine without crack or shadow. These children threatened the purity myth, not because of who they were, but because of what monarchy needed them to be. 2. Dynastic strategy and the politics of appearance. The second force was diplomacy, marriages, succession, and alliances forged like treaties carved in flesh and lineage. Every royal birth was a future bargaining chip. A princess might become a queen of another nation. A prince might secure peace through marriage or produce heirs for territories contested by rival dynasties. Royal children were international assets before they were individuals. But to perform, royalty required mastery of grace, languages, etiquette, and ceremony. A child who did not communicate in expected ways, who learned at a different pace, who expressed joy or curiosity outside courtly norms, such a child could not fulfill diplomatic destiny. From this vantage, the palace interpreted difference not as variation, but as disqualification. The tragedy is not that they doubted the child. The tragedy is that they doubted dignity beyond utility. Royalty valued what a child could represent, not who they could be. In that worldview, to spare a child from political exploitation was seen as kindness. To keep them private was considered protection. The logic was flawed, but it was sincere. Power convinces itself it is merciful even while it silences. 3. Theology, superstition, and the fear of judgment. Before the language of chromosomes existed, theology filled the gap. Atypical birth was often interpreted as divine message, a punishment, a warning, a sign of spiritual impurity. Clergy debated meaning. Courts whispered about curses. Mothers blamed themselves in secret prayers beneath cathedral arches. Some believed God marked the child to test a ruler's virtue. Others whispered that hidden sins in the dynasty had finally surfaced. Royal confessions increased, pilgrimages multiplied, donations to monasteries quietly surged following such births. Silence became piety. Concealment became repentance. Saints were painted with halos. Children who smiled differently were hidden inside chambers. It was not science that dictated fate. It was superstition masquerading as righteousness. And though kingdoms fell, the echo of this logic remains wherever society equates worth with conformity. 4. The architecture of secrecy. Finally, we must face the system itself. Royalty did not merely have power. It had infrastructure for secrecy, private wings, servants sworn to silence, coded records, private chapels, remote estates, monasteries and convents secure in loyalty. If ordinary families struggled visibly with disability, royal families struggled invisibly, behind velvet curtains and locked doors. Their resources allowed concealment. Their reputation demanded it. Their archives curated reality. We do not meditate on this to condemn families, but to confront a paradigm. When the world prizes reputation above humanity, humanity evaporates quietly. Across eras, across borders, the method was consistent. A child is born. A midwife lowers her eyes. A note is scribbled, then crossed out. A door closes. A rumor circulates once, then never again. This was not one dynasty's shame. It was a pattern upheld by an entire culture of power. Private love, public erasure. And yet, humanity persisted in private. We find traces. Folded drawings hidden in nurses' trunks. Prayer bookmarks pressed with petals of flowers children once picked. Toy horses and faded ribbons tucked into desk drawers of queens. Monastery ledgers filled with affection instead of rank. Affection existed. It simply could not exist publicly. There is a heartbreaking paradox here. They were hidden because they were loved, and hidden because love was powerless against order. A parent's tears could not rewrite coronation doctrine. A sibling's laughter could not undo dynastic anxiety. A nurse's tenderness could not rewrite the laws of succession. Those who loved them whispered into a world that needed shouts, and yet their whispers survived where proclamations decayed. What this tells us about power. These stories force us to reevaluate power not as strength, but as fragility. If a system cannot tolerate difference, it is weak. If identity must be perfect to be worthy, it is cruel. If love must hide to exist, the structure it bows to is broken. The forgotten royal children show us that power does not corrupt only through brutality. It also corrupts through fear. Fear of losing face, fear of losing myth, fear of losing control. True strength embraces imperfection. True nobility protects vulnerability. True legacy remembers all, not only those fit for marble and crown. A new lens of memory. Today, we do not retell these stories to shame ancestors or condemn every palace chamber. We tell them because memory itself is justice. To be seen is dignity. To be remembered is restitution. To understand is to prevent repetition. Their lives are not cautionary tales. They are testimonies of existence, of quiet resilience, of joy that persisted despite architecture designed to contain it. History once demanded silence. We answer with acknowledgement. Their worth was never measured by thrones. Their value never depended on crowns. They mattered because they breathed. They mattered because they laughed. They mattered because they were. And now, at last, they are spoken aloud. History remembers kings for battles and treaties, queens for portraits and coronations, dynasties for borders and crowns. But sometimes, history's heartbeat lives elsewhere, in hands that never signed a decree, in voices never heard beyond stone walls, in simple acts of tenderness that resisted an empire's silence. For every royal decree that ordered secrecy, there existed someone who disobeyed quietly, not with rebellion, but with kindness, not loudly, but persistently. These quiet guardians left no statues, no medals, no family crests. Yet their loyalty to compassion formed gentle counterweight to a system built on spectacle and control. If the crown demanded perfection, they offered presence. If the palace enforced secrecy, they offered memory. If power could not see humanity, they did. Let us walk into the wings of history, where light fell softly and dignity was protected, not erased. The nurse who saved drawings. In England, we met a boy who loved gardens more than courts. Newspapers reported his absence politely. Official letters called his passing a mercy. But somewhere in a modest servant's trunk, years after palace gates closed each night, a nurse preserved drawings, small sketches of trees, birds, horses, and smiling figures. She did not keep them for duty. She kept them for love. Because a child who draws must be seen. No public mourning marked his passing. The state called his life a burden relieved. But this one woman, with quiet devotion, refused to let memory disappear. She held on to scraps of paper as if they were jewels, because to her, they were. In that simple act, she defeated erasure. She said, without speaking, he lived. He mattered. The attendant who became a world. In Russia, attendants rotated through palace nurseries like gears in a clock. But in one secluded wing, a young woman stayed longer than records expected. She taught a girl with gentle eyes how to braid a ribbon, how to clap to a rhythm, how to hum a lullaby. They were small lessons, unremarkable to the world, essential to them. When revolution came, she did not flee first. She stayed until she could no longer. What she left behind was not wealth, but worn toys, a comb wrapped in cloth, and a note pressed under a pillow. Forgive us. We do not know who she addressed, the child, the world, or herself. But through that note, she guided us to empathy centuries late. The monk who saw holiness, not failure. In Austria, an infant removed from court lived his brief life in a monastery. His days were not marked by ceremony, but by simple tasks, carrying water, sweeping steps, feeding chickens. Brothers wrote in ledgers that he found joy in ringing a small bell at dawn, laughing when birds answered. To monks, he was not a threat to a bloodline. He was a soul. When he died, they wrote, "He has returned to God, who loved him better than this world could." These men, sworn to humility, understood something palaces could not. Dignity is not measured in ability, but in being. They buried him as one of their own. No rank, no shame. A child, loved and released with grace. The governess who taught slowly, patiently. In Bavaria, a princess learned differently. Court tutors measured intelligence in Latin declensions and court posture. She learned in moments how to hold a spoon without spilling, how to smile when birds sang near her window. Her governess did not hurry her. She did not shame her. She taught her how to button a dress, how to brush hair in soft strokes, how to water plants gently, how to listen to the world without demanding it bow. She wrote later in her diary, "She did not need to be a princess to be precious." Those words were never meant for public eyes, yet they endure, fragile and luminous. The groundskeeper's son who played without title. History does not record his rank because he had none, just a childhood memory. He remembered playing in palace gardens with a boy who laughed at ants, chased butterflies, clapped when clouds moved quickly. He did not know the boy's name, only that he disappeared whenever the royal family returned. Years later, reading a royal biography, he understood. But he remembered not absence. He remembered joy. No crown adorned their games. No court approved their friendship. Yet in a world built on above and below, they played side by side, equal in innocence. His memory outlasted the secrecy meant to silence it. The archivist who hesitated before crossing out a name. Sometimes kindness does not rescue. It simply refuses to forget. Imagine a scribe in a palace archive, quill lifted above freshly written ink, pausing as he draws one line through a name. He cannot stop the erasure, but he can hesitate. That hesitation is a form of witness. History is not only what is preserved. It is also what someone once wished to preserve and failed. We rarely know their names, but we feel their conscience. Quiet resistance versus loud power. These guardians did not overthrow kings. Their weapons were not swords, but patience. Their rebellion was not violent, but tender. They braided hair. They held hands through fevers. They tucked blankets. They traced letters with small fingers. They whispered lullabies no one else would remember. They collected pebbles and feathers as gifts. They sat beside beds through nights when silence felt heavier than stone. And in doing so, they disrupted the system in the only way they could, by giving love where the world demanded absence. What their kindness means today. Power tries to control memory. But kindness plants seeds memory cannot refuse to grow. These acts of care do more than soften history. They correct it. They remind us that humanity survives even when institutions fail. They force us to measure civilization not by the height of palaces, but by the softness of hands that wipe tears no one else acknowledged. Nurses, governesses, monks, gardeners, attendants, not rulers. Yet they ruled in the realm of compassion. Royalty constructed myths. They preserved truth. As long as one person remembers a laugh, a drawing, a song hummed in a quiet corridor, history cannot close the door entirely. And so in telling their stories, we honor two sets of lives. The children who lived gently, the adults who saw them clearly. Both were strong. Both resisted silence. Both remind us that dignity is not given by crowns, but by care. We speak now because they could not. But we speak softly, the way they once held small hands in theirs, with reverence, not rescue. The world does not change in a single moment. It shifts like light at dawn, quietly, slowly, until suddenly everything looks different. After World War II, humanity stepped blinking into a new age. Cities still smoldered. Maps were redrawn. Thrones fell, republics rose, borders trembled. Streets echoed with grief, rubble, apology, and promise. And in this vast, aching reconstruction came a quieter revolution, one not found in headlines or treaties, but in hearts, hospitals, and classrooms. For centuries, royalty hid children whose minds grew differently. Now the world itself had to answer a haunting question. If brutal regimes could justify atrocities by claiming superiority, what then did it mean when families, even royal ones, clung to their myths of perfection? War had shattered that illusion. Humanity finally faced itself and saw both darkness and possibility. A world tired of cruelty. The war did something monarchies never intended. It exposed the deadly logic of purity, bloodline, and superiority. Empires had justified cruelty in the name of power. Dictators had justified murder in the name of perfection. And suddenly, the belief that some lives held more worth than others stood revealed as monstrous in its consequences. Europe was forced to look in the mirror, and the reflection shook it. Royal secrecy, once considered dignified, now felt uneasy. The idea of protecting the throne through silence sounded chillingly familiar to systems the world had vowed never to repeat. Not immediately, but slowly, like frost melting under reluctant sunlight. Hospitals became gateways, not tombs. Before the war, a diagnosis meant isolation, misunderstanding, and often resignation. After the war, medical wards shifted from places of despair to laboratories of hope. Pediatric units began to bloom. Cardiac surgery advanced. New ethical standards emerged. Doctors no longer simply observed, they intervened. Where once whispers determined fate, now charts track progress. Where once devotion meant hiding, now devotion meant treatment. Children who would have been mourned in secret began living beyond infancy. They laughed in therapy rooms. They held pencils in rehabilitation clinics. They learned their first words in speech rooms filled with toys, not marble. And slowly, society realized something profound. Potential does not disappear because it looks different. Science found vocabulary where shame once spoke. In 1959, geneticists finally identified the cause of Down syndrome, trisomy 21. A third copy of a chromosome, not failure, not divine punishment, not moral stain. Nothing mystical, nothing shameful, just biology. Knowledge did not erase prejudice overnight, but it began to untangle myth from truth. And in archives, a strange thing happened. Where scribes once crossed out names, doctors now wrote them gently in charts. Where priests once blamed fate, scientists mapped genes. Where nannies once saved drawings in secret, therapists pinned artwork proudly to walls. Science did not only clarify, it legitimized love that had existed all along. The royal walls cracked, quietly at first. Public announcements did not come immediately. Palaces did not fling open doors. But subtle things began to change. A royal carriage slowed near a children's hospital. A monarch visited a ward and held a small hand. A princess sponsored research quietly, without naming the reason. A queen donated funds to an orphanage with special wards. These gestures were small, but seismic. In corridors once governed by duty, humanity crept back in. Royalty discovered a truth older than any crown. There is no heritage purer than kindness. The slow undoing of secrecy. The old approach, hide and hope the world forgets, faltered in a society now obsessed with transparency, justice, and accountability. Reporters asked harder questions. Historians pursued missing records. Families demanded dignity. Public opinion shifted. Monarchy no longer existed above society. It existed within it. And society demanded fairness, not fantasy. So the last generation of hidden royal children grew up quietly, cared for in private facilities, attended by doctors and educators rather than stone walls and shame. And slowly, silence turned into selective truth. Not loud, but louder than it had ever been. A moral line was drawn, not in law, but in conscience. Nuremberg trials had shown the world what happens when society decides certain lives are less worthy. When the public learned that disabled children in Nazi Germany were murdered in the name of purity, parents everywhere, royal or not, had to confront a chilling question. If the worst evil justified cruelty by claiming superiority, how could anyone continue to hide a child out of fear of imperfection? Silence was no longer protective, it was complicit. So change grew, not out of politics, but out of awakening. A new kind of strength. Strength was no longer the polished image on a balcony. Strength became the quiet act of walking into a pediatric ward and sitting beside a child others had ignored. Strength became a parent refusing shame. Strength became a sibling holding a hand, not a dynasty's expectations. Strength became a doctor saying, "We can help, and we will." Royalty did not lead this movement. It followed it, humbled, learning, evolving. And in that humility, royalty became more human, and therefore, strangely, more noble. The world learned a new definition of legacy. Legacy was no longer bloodline purity. Legacy was compassion. Legacy was education. Legacy was intervention and inclusion. Children once hidden became children supported. Not always celebrated publicly, but cared for, named, acknowledged. Monarchies did not transform overnight into champions of disability rights. But for the first time, they stopped pretending difference erased worth. Public silence turned into private acceptance, and slowly into cautious openness. It was not perfection, but it was progress. A door cracked open, and light seeped in. And so, as the 20th century advanced, something miraculous emerged from centuries of concealed sorrow. Hope, infrastructure, recognition, language that honored rather than erased. Not every family changed. Not every throne adapted. But enough did that the future could imagine something new. A world where being different was not a sentence. It was simply a way of being human. The palaces began to understand what the monasteries once did, what nurses always knew, what garden boys and tutors and nannies felt in their bones. Dignity is not granted by birth. It exists at birth. A crown never defined worth. It merely blinded people from seeing it sooner. As the world rebuilt itself after fire, so too did it rebuild its understanding of what it means to belong. These children, once hidden from history, did not demand a revolution. They inspired one simply by existing. And the world, finally, painfully, beautifully, began to meet them in the light. Today, we know something the palaces of old did not, or perhaps could not bear to see. We know that humanity does not need symmetry to be sacred. We know that dignity is not measured in fluency or posture. We know that life has value not because it fulfills a role, but because it exists. And most importantly, we know the science. Down syndrome is not a verdict, a punishment, or a stain on lineage. It is a chromosomal variation, a natural part of biological diversity. One extra copy of chromosome 21, nothing more mystical or ominous than that. But science alone does not make understanding. Knowledge must be paired with empathy to become wisdom. So in this chapter, we step forward into the world of genetics, medicine, education, and modern ethics, not to rewrite the past, but to illuminate it. Chromosomes and truth, not myth. In the early 20th century, scientists first observed chromosomes under microscopes powerful enough to see what kings and priests never could. And in 1959, geneticist Jerome Lejeune identified the chromosomal cause of Down syndrome, trisomy 21. A revelation quiet but seismic. For the first time, humanity could say with certainty, this is not moral failure. This is not fate or curse. This is nature, simple, random, real. The myth shattered. But breaking a myth does not immediately free the world from it. Human beliefs often lag behind science, sometimes by decades, sometimes by centuries. Yet this breakthrough planted a seed, one that would grow into a new understanding of childhood, personhood, and potential. Medicine, extending life, not limiting it. Once, many babies with Down syndrome died before adulthood, not because the condition doomed them, but because society did. Lack of heart surgery, lack of medical expertise, lack of belief in their capacity to thrive. But the late 20th century changed that. Cardiac advances, early intervention, therapies, inclusion, life expectancy rose. Not through miracles, through care. Children who once would have been hidden began to learn to read, to dance, to speak, to sign, to swim, to love, to live. They did not need palaces to shine. They needed opportunity. In this light, history's silence feels even heavier. Not because we judge the past harshly, but because we now know what could have been possible. Education, the classroom as a throne room of dignity. It is easy to measure potential by narrow standards. Perfect diction, flawless memory, fast logic. But classrooms around the world have been rewriting the definition of intelligence quietly, steadily, beautifully. Children with Down syndrome learn through rhythm, routine, tactile experience, songs, and play. They are storytellers. They are artists. They are athletes. They are community builders. They are friends who feel deeply, forgive quickly, and love openly. They may find complexity in simplicity, and simplicity in complexity. What court etiquette once dismissed, modern understanding celebrates. Different ways of thinking are not deficits, they are diversity. Where royal tutors once saw failure, educators today see possibility. Society's mirror, growth, and its unfinished work. The world has moved forward, but not evenly. Some nations lead in inclusion, others trail in misunderstanding. Some families embrace difference as gift, others fear judgment. Some communities celebrate diversity, others cling to perfection myths echoing ancient palaces. Even now, prenatal testing brings new ethical questions. The power to know can become the power to exclude. Choice is complicated. Progress is not linear. Yet humanity continues to learn, slowly, painfully, beautifully. Where secrecy once stood, dialogue begins. Where shame once lived, acceptance emerges. Where isolation ruled, community grows. There is still work to do, but shadows shrink when named. Seeing past role and function. Royalty once taught the world that value came from duty, representation, performance. Yet modern advocates remind us, worth is not conditional. Value is not earned. Existence is enough. A child who cannot bow in perfect form can still bow in gratitude. A child who cannot recite diplomatic treaties can still express love purely. A child who does not speak court language can speak through laughter, touch, presence. They do not mirror society, they reveal it. Through them, we see what humans prize, what we fear, and what we still must grow toward. Perhaps the greatest lesson they offer is this: human greatness is not measured in crowns or ceremonies. It is measured in kindness, in patience, in the courage to include, in the grace to learn from those history once placed in shadows. A new kind of royalty. If we imagine a future palace, not one built of marble and hierarchy, but of empathy and belonging, what might its legacy be? A kingdom where every child is welcomed, every mind is honored, every difference enriches, every voice matters. Not a throne room of perfection, but a home of humanity. The old world crowned power. The new world can crown compassion. Those once hidden would not just be seen, they would be celebrated. Not because they fit a mold, but because they break it in ways that teach us to be better. The world once whispered about them. Now it can learn from them. Looking back with knowledge, looking forward with grace. We do not condemn ancestors who did not know what we know now. But neither do we excuse silence. We honor by acknowledging. We remember by learning. Science freed understanding. Medicine extended years. Education unlocked potential. Society, though imperfect, continues evolving. And with each step, a truth grows brighter. Human dignity never belonged to kings. It belongs to everyone. The children history once had now guide us. They teach us that life's value is not measured in crowns or courts, but in hearts and homes, in laughter over lessons, in joy unguarded, in love unconditioned. The world that once could not see them now begins to understand. They were never less. We were simply late to see how much more they were. When we began this journey, we entered a world of echoes, marble chambers, gilded thrones, locked rooms, dust floating in shafts of morning light. We traced the footsteps of children whose names never appeared in history books, whose faces never looked down from palace portraits, whose laughter never carried into banquet halls. They lived not in public record, but in pauses, in margins, in footnotes of forgotten ledgers. Now we leave those quiet rooms behind, but we do not leave them empty. We leave them illuminated. Because the true measure of history is not whether it once looked away, but whether we refuse to do so again. The story you have heard is not about tragedy alone. It is about transformation, responsibility, awakening. It is about what we choose to see once we finally understand what sight means. And it brings us here, not to a conclusion, but to an invitation. From silence to speech. Silence was once the strongest force in this story. Quieter than prayer, heavier than marble, more enduring than royal decree. Silence protected crowns and preserved myth. It shielded power but suffocated truth. Today, silence is broken, gently, deliberately, with reverence. We speak not to shame those who lived before us, but to honor those who lived without being spoken for. We speak to say, you were here. You mattered. You were not mistakes. The world was simply unready to see your light. Naming is an act of dignity. Memory is an act of justice. Acknowledgement is an act of love. Now that the truth is visible, we carry the weight of it and the responsibility to shape what comes next. The mirror in the mosaic. History is not a distant artifact. It is a mirror reflecting not just what was, but what could be. And in the mosaic of royal chambers and forgotten nurseries, we see more than lost stories. We see ourselves. We see every moment the world still measures worth by perfection. We see every institution that hides vulnerability behind polished walls. We see every family afraid of being seen as imperfect. We see every modern pressure disguised as legacy, honor, reputation. We are not as far from palaces as we imagine. But where old courts built walls, we can build windows. Where monarchies hid difference, we can reveal it with pride. Where history pressed silence like wax, we can speak clearly, boldly, tenderly. The children we remember today are not relics of royal shame. They are beacons for human courage. Two ways to lead, by power or by kindness. Monarchies once ruled by force and fear, by armies, alliances, inheritance. Yet none of those instruments preserve their memory as powerfully as the quiet hands who nurtured hidden children behind closed doors. Power may build kingdoms, but kindness is what keeps humanity sovereign. What if the highest form of royalty was never the crown, but the courage to embrace imperfection publicly? What if the legacy worth passing down is not bloodline purity, but the humility to love beyond expectation? True nobility is not superiority, It is stewardship. Stewardship of lives, of stories, of dignity. And this story asks us to choose what kind of stewards we will be. The future they gift us. The children who once lived in shadows now stand at the edge of our collective memory, offering not sorrow but vision. They ask us, will we define worth by achievement or by presence? Will we view difference as burden or as variety? Will we inherit old fears or build new understandings? Their lives contained lessons ahead of their time. Joy without condition, curiosity without ego, affection without agenda, wonder without need for approval. They remind us that intellect is not the only measure of depth, that success is not the only measure of meaning, that perfection is not the only form of beauty. In their gentleness, they held a wisdom the world was slow to hear. Now that we finally listen, we do not find weakness, we find truth. A crown reimagined. Imagine a world where crowns are not symbols of superiority, but of service. Where legacy is not guarded by walls, but shared through kindness. Where power is not proven by hiding imperfection, but by standing beside it. This is not naivete, it is evolution. Empires rise and fall. Bloodlines tighten and dissolve. Statues crumble. Records fade. But compassion endures. And dignity, once given, outlives every king. The children we reclaim today are not footnotes in royal decline. They are the architects of a gentler kind of future, one where humanity, not hierarchy, defines our worth. The light we leave on. Somewhere, in a museum drawer or a monastery ledger or a servant's attic box, a forgotten drawing remains. A childish sketch of a tree, or a bird, or a sun. Someone once held that scrap like a treasure. Someone believed memory mattered. We honor them too, the quiet guardians who loved without permission. They prove that history's most noble acts are often invisible at the time they're made. Today, we simply join them. We do not romanticize sorrow. We do not dramatize suffering. We do not claim to speak for those who cannot speak. We bear witness. We hold space. We turn silence into story, not loud, not violent, but honest. The locked doors of history are not ours to break down. But we can leave a candle outside each one and speak the names that were never spoken aloud. Sometimes justice begins not with thunder, but with light. A final thought, carried forward. The children hidden in palaces did not ask to change the world. Yet they do, because remembering them changes us. And so we leave this story differently than we entered it. Not heavier, but wiser. Not mournful, but motivated. Not angry at the past, but determined for the future. Let us carry forward what was once confined. Let us say, every life deserves sunlight. Let us teach, difference is not weakness. Let us build societies where every child is celebrated, not hidden. Because royalty is not in blood. It is in our capacity to see one another fully and love without fear. And the greatest kingdoms we will ever build are the ones where no one disappears. History feels safe when it stays behind glass, when it stays in palaces and archives, when it speaks about them, not us. But the truth of every historical story is that it eventually becomes a mirror. And this one is no exception. We have walked through centuries of forgotten rooms, through nursery wings that never echoed with celebration, through gardens where laughter hid in shadows. We have listened to quiet guardians, explored science and progress, honored memory. Now we stand at the edge of that journey. And the question is no longer about royalty. It is about us, a crown we all wear. It is tempting to believe that cruelty belongs to kings, that secrecy was the product of palaces and titles. But power, in its simplest form, lives everywhere humans fear to be seen as imperfect. You do not need a throne to build walls around image. You do not need jewels to hide what you fear others will judge. You do not need royal blood to protect pride at the cost of honesty. Every society carries echoes of those old palaces, in classrooms, workplaces, family dinners, online spaces. Every one of us has the capacity, at times, to choose appearance over authenticity. This story forces us to ask, where do we still hide difference? Where do we still measure worth by conformity? Where do we still believe perfection earns belonging? It is not kings alone who feared vulnerability. It is humans. The new silence. Silence no longer looks like a locked tower room. It looks like a whisper, a glance, a hesitation. It looks like changing the subject when a child struggles. It looks like pretending not to notice discomfort. It looks like avoiding eye contact instead of offering connection. Modern silence wears polite clothing, but it can still wound. We promise equality in speeches, then enforce sameness in practice. We celebrate diversity in theory, then reward uniformity in daily life. We praise inclusion publicly, yet privately fear being changed by it. That tension is not a relic, it is alive. The question is whether we choose to confront it. The courage to see. Seeing takes courage. It always has. The palace mistake was not ignorance alone, it was avoidance. It was the belief that not looking could make difference disappear. But difference did not disappear, only dignity did. So today, we do something the past could not. We look, not to judge, but to understand. We acknowledge, not to expose, but to honor. We listen, not to pity, but to learn. True seeing is not passive. It reshapes us. It asks us to release perfection as a measure of value. It asks us to honor vulnerability as strength. It asks us to defend every life's right to be visible, not just in palaces, in our homes, our communities, our digital spaces, our hearts. Empathy without costume. Empathy is not a performance. It is not charity, nor gesture, nor virtue signaling. Empathy is a discipline, a daily choice. It means staying present when understanding is difficult. It means listening without assuming. It means offering dignity instead of rescue. It means remembering. Nobody needs to earn the right to be seen as fully human. This is not pity. This is equality. And it is harder than it sounds, because equality demands humility. It demands we lower the armor of ego and status and certainty. It demands we admit we still have more to learn. That was the palace's greatest failure. It mistook fragility for strength, mistook pride for protection, mistook silence for safety. We can choose differently. A new definition of honor. The old world honored bloodline. The new world is invited to honor belonging. The old world worshipped lineage. The new world can celebrate life itself. Honor is not inherited, it is practiced. Honor is the teacher who waits patiently for a child to finish a sentence. Honor is the friend who includes without conditions. Honor is the parent who sees possibility where others see limitation. Honor is the citizen who challenges systems that shrink space for difference. Honor is not born from title, it is earned by compassion. These are the crowns that matter now. The future will ask about us. Generations from now, people will look back on this moment. And they will not ask, did you have wealth? Did you have power? Did you win arguments, climb ladder, perfect image? They will ask, did you create a world where everyone could belong? Did you speak for those history forgot? Did you make room at the table for those long overlooked? Did you choose curiosity over fear? Did you let love, not pride, guide you? These will be the true measures of legacy. We cannot undo the past, but we can prevent its repetition, not by erasing it, but by learning from it. Memory is not a burden. It is a compass. Their light, our responsibility. The children once hidden did not ask for monuments. They asked, simply by existing, to be seen. And now they offer us a gift, a chance to build a world that does not hide the gentle, the different, the unexpected. They straighten our posture as humans. They refine our values. They remind us that greatness is not grand. It is quiet and kind and brave enough to make space for everyone. They were once shadows in royal halls. Today, they are lanterns in our moral landscape. Our task is not to speak over them. Our task is to speak forward from them. To build a world where no life needs to be justified. Where no child must earn visibility. Where no difference is mistaken for defect. Where no future is predetermined by prejudice. That is the inheritance worth claiming. That is the kingdom worth building. A closing thought for the heart. We often ask, what made those hidden children different? But perhaps the better question is, what makes us think difference ever diminished their worth? Let us leave this story not with sorrow, but with resolve. Not with guilt, but with clarity. Not looking backward in judgment, but forward in stewardship. Because history does not change when we learn it. It changes when we live differently because of it. And so we step from the dim halls of memory into the open light of choice. The question that remains is not what those royal children could have become, but what we will become now that we remember them.